Hey guys, I'm glad you're here. Today's project is this featherlite trimmer from Weed Eater. And the problem is that it won't start, but there's more wrong than just that. This trimmer had suffered drop damage and we'll need to see if the damage is repairable. Let's see if we can fix it. I'm not really sure how you guys feel about this trimmer because I really like this brand. It's extremely light and it's easy to use and very affordable. And as long as you take care of it, it'll last for some time. However, this one was getting difficult to start and finally it wouldn't start at all. So what happened was it was smashed on the ground out of frustration. It was then given to me so I could do whatever I wanted with it. After I was told what they did, I realized very quickly that my options for this thing were really limited. There's some obvious damage, but some that isn't very noticeable at all. Let's take a good look around and identify everything that's wrong. Let's start with the most obvious problem, which is the spark plug. The impact was located here, and it broke the spark plug, so we're going to need to replace it. There are a few scratches on the rear cover as well, but it's not cracked, so let's keep moving on. There's also a crack on the top part of the air filter cover, which doesn't look that bad, but it hints to a serious problem. If you look from the front, you'll see that the air filter base is broken. When we take the cover off, we'll see just how bad it really looks. And after taking the cover and the filter off, we can see that the air filter base is about 80% broken. They did a really good job of breaking this thing. Let's check and make sure that the choke button is still working like it should. And it looks like it's releasing just like it's supposed to, so we're good there. Now this trimmer did come with fuel in it, so let's pour it out and see if there's anything wrong with it. It might be the reason why this thing didn't start in the first place. And what we're looking for is the concentration of 2-cycle oil or even water contamination. The oil mixture is pretty heavy, but that's not a very serious problem. After pouring out most of the fuel, there is some water at the bottom, but not enough to be a problem. It's now time to stop looking at this trimmer and get started diagnosing it. First thing we'll do is replace the broken spark plug and then examine the tip for carbon deposits. Whenever you change spark plugs, make sure you replace them with what the manufacturer put in there. And after replacing the plug, I'll then spray some starting fluid in the carburetor and try starting it. Yes, I'm very aware that using it is harmful, but I'm only using it to test if it does work. Well, fortunately for us, it did run for a few seconds, so let's get the carb off and inspect it. We'll have to take off the air filter base to get to the carburetor, and since it's not completely broken, we might be able to put it back together. And after a bit of finagling, we were able to put the base pretty much back together. If we're going to fix this for good, we'd probably use a hot iron to weld the crack back together again. Now remove the fuel lines and disconnect the throttle linkage from the carburetor. If your fuel lines are brittle, you might want to consider replacing them at this point. Now let's remove the top part of the carburetor to take a look at the pumping side and see if there's any problems with the diaphragm flaps or any debris in the carburetor. If the two check valve flaps are bent or not lying flat like the rest of the diaphragm, then the carburetor will not pump fuel into the carb and it will never start. And luckily, the two flaps are in great shape. After lifting the diaphragm up, we can see that it's pretty clean. Let's take a look at the other side of the carburetor and see if it's clean as well. And it looks really clean, so we should go ahead and put this side of the carburetor back together since it's in working condition. Now let's take off the plate that covers the metering diaphragm. This is more than likely the reason why the trimmer didn't start. Okay, it's definitely not new, but to be honest, it's really not that bad. The carb would have needed an adjustment to run with this diaphragm, but the tuning window would have been very narrow. And since we're here, we'll go ahead and replace it anyway and hope it starts. The new diaphragm is very soft and flexible, of course. It'll make the tuning much easier. At this point, we can put the carburetor back together and then reinstall it back onto the engine. You'll want to start by reconnecting the throttle linkage to the carburetor, and there's only one hole in the carburetor to put it into. Follow that up with the two fuel lines. And after reinstalling the fuel lines, you can now put the air filter base and the air filter and its cover back onto the engine. Let's put some gas into the tank and replace the fuel cap, and then we'll try priming the fuel system by pressing the primer bulb several times, and then we'll try starting it. Okay, now I see a huge problem, and this is the cause for this whole entire repair. The primer bulb isn't working correctly, and if it's not working correctly, the carburetor will never work and the engine will never start. And even after removing the fuel cap to watch the fuel return from the carburetor, we can see there is no fuel coming back to the tank, so there is a serious problem here. The easiest thing to do is to check to see if the primer bulb isn't working. And to do this, what we're going to do is remove the fuel lines to it and temporarily replace the primer bulb with a different one, and then prime the fuel system with it. Now this isn't the correct primer bulb, but it will work to test to see if the original bulb is broken. And unfortunately, the top fuel line is a bit torn up, so we're going to have to replace it. Well, it looks like this top port on the carburetor is severely bent, so we'll have to bend it back into shape to put the new fuel line on. More than likely, this is damage from when the trimmer was smashed on the ground. The fuel line that comes from the carburetor will go to the smaller port on the primer bulb, and the longer port will go back to the fuel tank. Hopefully when we press the primer bulb several times, it will start to pull gas into it. And if it does, then the original bulb was the problem from the beginning. Fortunately, it's pulling gas into the bulb. So let's swap the lines real quickly and put it back to the original bulb and see if it'll pull gas now that it's in the lines. And unfortunately, the original bulb isn't working, so it's confirmed that that's the problem. Let's replace the primer bulb temporarily with this one and try starting it. When trying to start this trimmer, I will do the least amount of editing as possible so you can see what really happens. So it didn't start, so it might be flooded. Let's try starting it without the choke and full throttle and see if we can clear it. So it's still not starting, so it definitely wasn't flooded. Let's not give up and try starting it with its normal procedure and see if we can get it started. Well, unfortunately it didn't start. Now we don't know when it was last ran with fuel in the tank and the carburetor. So let's think outside the box and try manually priming it and see if we can get it to clear the carburetor, and hopefully when it does run with fresh fuel through the carburetor, it'll clear itself out. Well, it finally started, but it wasn't a fair start, as we had to help it. We'll let it cool down for about 15 minutes and see if we can get it started on its own. If it doesn't start, then we might need to consider a new carburetor. And after letting it cool down and doing a cold start, everything seems to be working like it's supposed to. So my question to you is, would you want to own a featherlite trimmer in your lineup of power tools? It's 50% more expensive than the cheapest trimmer at Megamart, but is it 50% better? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.